Welcome to Brussels Forum 2020. We are pleased to introduce the Vice President for Foreign Policy at the German Marshall Fund, Dr. Ian Lesser.
Good morning and good afternoon from Brussels. Welcome to the second week of our virtual Brussels Forum. As many of you will know, Brussels Forum is our flagship event, and we're really delighted to be able to present it to you this year in this virtual format. Thanks so much for joining us. At the outset, let me just say a very big thank you to our founding partners, Daimler and the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and also to our forum partner, Deloitte. And to all our associate and supporting partners and our knowledge partners, a very big thank you as well. We couldn't put Brussels Forum on without you. In previous sessions, we focused on American politics, European politics. We've talked a lot about the geopolitical implications of the COVID crisis and the economic crisis. And today we're going to extend that conversation by talking more specifically about the role of China in the post-pandemic order and how Western partners and others around the world should be dealing with that. We also want to mention to you that not only is this the 15th edition of Brussels Forum, but it's actually the 15th anniversary of GMF's Asia program. And so this is a significant discussion for us in many ways. And thank you for joining again. We have a very prominent group of public figures to help us with this conversation today. And we're really delighted to have Noah Barkin, Senior Visiting Fellow at GMF, to moderate the conversation. I'll let him introduce the panel in a moment, but let me also just mention that very shortly after this session ends, actually 30 minutes later, we will have a special conversation with German Defense Minister Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer. And I'm told that the best thing to do is to actually refresh your browser in order to watch it. We'll give you a 30-minute break, but I hope you can join us for that as well. So now, without further ado, let me turn the floor to Noah, and we look forward to the conversation. Thank you all for joining again. Noah, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Ian. Can everyone hear me? I'd like to offer a warm welcome to our panelists and to our audience out there. As Ian just mentioned, today we're going to be talking about China, which was already emerging as a dominant theme in the transatlantic relationship before COVID-19 broke out. But I think we would all agree that the pandemic has brought China into even greater focus. We've seen a dramatic escalation of the rhetoric between Washington and Beijing in recent months. And this escalation is a source of growing anxiety in Europe and other countries, which are worried about a new Cold War in which they will be forced to choose between the world's two biggest economies. We have an excellent panel today to discuss these issues. Let me introduce our distinguished speakers. Marsha Blackburn is a senator from the state of Tennessee. She is a member of the Republican Party and serves on the Armed Services and Judiciary Committees, among others. Thank you for being here, Senator Blackburn. Chris Coons is a senator from the state of Delaware. He is a member of the Democratic Party and sits on the Foreign Relations and Judiciary Committees, among others. Welcome, Senator Coons.
Thank you.
Dr. Joseph Wu is Minister of Foreign Affairs for Taiwan, a position he has held since early 2018. Minister Wu has held senior positions in the Taiwanese government for the past 2 decades. Thank you for being with us, Minister Wu. And last but not least, Reinhard Bütikofer is a member of the European Parliament for the Greens Party. He sits on the Foreign Affairs and International Trade Committees and is one of the leading voices in Brussels on China. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Bütikofer.
My pleasure.
We have about an hour and we're hoping for a real discussion. So I would ask all the panelists to keep their responses short and pithy. And we will try to leave time at the end for some questions from the audience. If you do want to send a question, you can send it via Twitter, hashtag Brussels Forum, or via email to brusselsforum@gmfus.org. Now, my first question is going to go to Senator Blackburn, who I understand unfortunately has to leave us midway through our discussion to attend a meeting related to her Armed Services Committee duties. Senator Blackburn, you were considered one of the leading China hawks in the Senate. Can you tell us from your perspective how the pandemic has changed the U.S. view on China?
Yes, Noah, thank you so much. And thank you to the German Marshall Fund for putting the emphasis on this transatlantic relationship and the cooperation that is so necessary there. The issues dealing with China actually are issues that came to my attention through much of our entertainment community in Tennessee, as we were fighting intellectual property violations, infringements. As many of those that are listening and watching today know, we have a very vibrant entertainment community. We have a lot of musicians, a lot of actors. We have the book publishing industry is very important in our state. So when you go back into the mid-90s, that is where my work on this issue really began. And then bringing that to Congress when I came in 2003 and working on the issues of intellectual property protections for individuals, and my work in the House at the Energy and Commerce Committee, where I served as vice chairman and then chairman of communications and technology. What I did was to realize the impact China had on these supply chains as we looked at telecommunications, as we were looking at aviation, as we looked at pharmaceuticals, and realizing that our vaccine shortages, those things were caused sometimes because that supply chain was housed in China. And then as we have the advent of COVID-19, what we saw play out, and I think this is where so many in the United States realized there was a problem in having given so much of the supply chain production in pharmaceuticals over to China, and with that also being disturbed and troubled by the fact that this is a virus that started in Wuhan. They knew that they had it. They chose not to share that information. Seeing the way they spent time hoarding and buying PPE and then elevating the price of that PPE. This is all something that added to the distrust of relying on them for that supply chain. We all wish that they had been more forthcoming in sharing the information with us that this was a highly contagious and deadly virus that was not only an outbreak, but an epidemic and then moved to a pandemic.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. I wanted to turn now to Foreign Minister Wu. Foreign Minister Wu, Taiwan has had a good crisis, if one can describe it in those terms. Won international accolades for its success in containing the virus. But COVID-19 has also deepened the tensions between the US and China, as we mentioned, and Taiwan is really on the front lines of this conflict.
Yes.
Can you tell us about what has changed for Taiwan this year? What is the mood right now?
The mood here in Taiwan is that indeed COVID-19 has changed a lot of things here in Taiwan and in our relations with other countries. And when we talked about the outbreak of the disease in late December last year, we saw some reports. And because of our long experience in knowing about the political system in China, We understand that the transparency or honesty is not what the regime is based on. And therefore, we got nervous over those quiet reports on the internet, and we started preparing ourselves. And because we have prepared for this outbreak, and therefore we seem to be more successful than most of the countries in the world. But of course, the Chinese government seem to look at our success as their own humiliation, and they don't seem to be happy about that. And they try to start a disinformation campaign against Taiwan. And not only that, they also have their military threat against us. And at the same time, they try to isolate further Taiwan internationally. So this is what we are confronting against. But if you look at the positive side, because of Taiwan's success in dealing with the pandemic, and also because Taiwan's generosity in providing the face masks and other relief materials to other countries in a selfless way, we want a lot of friendship. For instance, in May this year, when we again tried to apply for our participation in the World Health Assembly, we not only got the support from the traditional friends, we also have many friends in Europe supported Taiwan who never supported Taiwan before. So this is a new situation. And I think you touched on a very important issue for us to deal with. That is the confrontation in between the United States and China, and also a changing dynamics in the transatlantic relationship. And this is the whole new world that we need to deal with. But from Taiwan's perspective, one thing is very important. That is the value that we are on, the value that we shared with each other. That is democracy, that is the respect of human rights. And that is the value that we operate on. We want to develop further relations, closer friendship with the friends who have the same values that we have. But at the same time, we also try very carefully not to provoke any crisis in between Taiwan and China. But this is a very delicate, a balancing act. It's very difficult, but that is something that we are trying to cope with.
Thank you very much. I wanted to turn to Senator Coons, Senator Coons, you said last year in a speech at the Wilson Center that the U.S. must strive to coexist, compete, and cooperate with China. Has the pandemic changed your views in any way on that?
Well, Noah, thanks for the opportunity to be with you and with this great panel. The United States is experiencing three great crises at the same time. The pandemic of COVID-19, the economic recession that's been caused by our nationwide economic shutdown, which we're now trying to reverse as we reopen, and a renewed nationwide focus on our deep racial inequalities caused by the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis by police. The United States cannot lead and cannot be the country that we all hope we will be if we are not a more just and more equal nation. And we've seen demonstrations all over the world in response to concerns about racial inequality, both in the United States and around the world. My comments about the US-China relationship and how we should approach it that you just referenced from the Wilson speech I gave, I think is more important than ever. The Trump administration does have a list of grievances between the United States and China. The issues around intellectual property that Senator Blackburn referenced are ones that I worked on 2 decades ago in the private sector and have worked hard to address here in Congress, and the ways in which we have tried to and need to still address intellectual property theft and IP issues remain important and central. But in the context of this pandemic, I hear from too many European leaders concerns that the United States is absent, is not participating. The idea that we could or should sever our ties to the World Health Organization in the middle of a global pandemic, where the United States should be leading a global effort, partnering with our closest and trusted allies in developing therapeutics and a vaccine, misses, I think, this moment. We've given China an opening to reverse their early setbacks in terms of their global reputation based on some of the issues the foreign minister just raised about transparency and truthfulness and being forthcoming in the early stages of the pandemic. And today around the world, in too many countries, there's literally a debate about which model has produced a safer outcome. Because the United States continues to have a raging pandemic. We've lost 110,000 Americans. China is now using surplus material that they are manufacturing to engage in humanitarian relief diplomacy and is advocating for their model. And as Senator Blackburn and Foreign Minister Wu and I think would all agree, we are here because of the shared values of the United States, our European allies, Taiwan. We are all committed to free and open societies where the worth of the individual combined with a commitment to justice and to rule of law stands in sharp contrast. So I do think, as I commented at the Wilson Center last year, that the United States has to recognize there are key areas where global progress and security depends upon US-China cooperation in combating this pandemic, in combating nuclear proliferation, in combating climate change, in combating wildlife trafficking. But there are other areas where we are in an intense and sharp competition, competition in the realm of ideas for how we should organize societies, and in terms of our alliances and relationships around the world. And it is my hope that we can avoid direct conflict, but that will only happen if we in the United States are our best selves, if we live up to our founding ideals, and if we address some of the long unresolved challenges in our own country that are now the subject of daily discussions and protests, and hopefully now action.
Thank you, Senator Coons. I wanted to turn to Reinhard Bütikofer. Mr. Bütikofer, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about where you think Europe is on China at the moment. A little over a year ago, the European Commission came out with a very toughly worded strategy paper, which labeled China a systemic rival, a strategic competitor. But it seems as if some of that momentum that leading up to that paper has been lost. We've, over the past few months, we've seen some incidents of self-censorship by the European External Action Service under pressure from China. German Chancellor Angela Merkel with her EU-China summit in Leipzig, which has now been postponed. With that, she wanted to sort of put the focus back on the partnership between Europe and China. Where are we now in Europe, and how do you think the pandemic has changed the views in European countries?
Well, no, let me first thank the German Marshall Fund for having me. I would say that a slowly moving process of alienation between Europe and Xi Jinping's China started years ago. I would say probably 4 or 5 years ago, when we saw the economic impacts of unfair Chinese trading practices with regard, for instance, to the British steel industry, where we lost thousands of jobs because of Chinese dumping exports. And over time, step by step, and for the better part, not noticed so much by the public, there was a shift in the basic sentiment. And this was then put into language by the External Action Service and the Commission last year, as you noted, when they described China fourfold as a partner, a negotiating partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. I would say that it's obvious that you cannot be a systemic rival on Monday and then return to looking for win-win cooperation as if you were not. So I think what we are learning now is that we have to accommodate our approach to China and seek ways of defining also our cooperation or our competition under the understanding that this rivalry is something that will not go away on short call. And look, there's never been a European development that went just straightforward. Europe's way of making advances is always by zigzagging, and you have some rollbacks, partial rollbacks, but I would say overall that China has been losing ground. And interestingly, not just in the political sphere, but also in the community. So there was a very highly acclaimed strategy paper by the German Federation of Industry January last year, and a similarly interesting paper by Business Europe, the Pan-EU Business Lobby, January this year, that struck a very critical tone with the Commission and the External Action Service. So, and since the pandemic broke, I think that China, well, trying to opportunistically exploit this, shot themselves in the foot. We have seen examples of elite capture. We have seen examples of cowardice also, but at the same time, I think China has, as I say, lost ground because of their increasingly arrogant and aggressive diplomacy, because of their infringement on European economic interests, because of the policies that they pursued, that the Chinese government pursued with regard to the Uyghurs, for instance. Last year, long before we ever thought of running into a health crisis, the European Parliament awarded its esteemed Sakharov Prize to a Uyghur intellectual, Professor Tohti, who's been in prison just for speaking his mind and standing up for the rights of his minority in China. So I think that China is now turning more aggressively against some European countries. Notably, the Chinese ambassadors in Sweden, London, Berlin, and France have been making some highly undiplomatic public statements. But of course, it is still not a given that Europe can easily come together to forge an agreed strategy. And this is what we're about exploring, how we can move forward now.
Thank you very much. I want to come back to Senator Blackburn before she has to go. Senator Blackburn, one of the criticisms of the Trump administration's China policy is that there hasn't been a concerted effort to build a coalition of like-minded countries to push back against Beijing. The president has said on a number of occasions that the EU is worse than China. I think the French president Emmanuel Macron has tried several times to convince President Trump to work together unsuccessfully. Can America take on China alone?
I don't think that what you're looking at is America alone. I do think that in this post-pandemic era, what you're looking at is a coalition of America and our allies. I have to tell you, as we have focused on the issue of China and supply chain production, you hear from other countries that say, we want to participate in creating new pathways on these supply chains. I think that's a very good thing. And that applies whether it is pharmaceuticals or electronics or telecommunications. There are other countries, there are individuals that are participating right now in your forum that are saying, we can be a part of this solution. And we can be a part of decoupling from China when it comes to these critical infrastructure supply chains. And we share with you the respect for intellectual property and for innovators being able to benefit from these inventions that they create. So I do think, and while you may see this administration focus on some of the trade deals that are going to be more equitable to the U.S. and more on a bilateral type process. I do think what you're going to see as we address the issue of China is all working together. And I will leave you now to make this meeting that is beginning right now at 9:30. And thank you so much for the attention to the issue. And I hope that we will continue the discussion and find resolutions that are going to be a good thing and a firm foundation for all of our countries. Thank you for letting me participate.
Thank you very much for joining us, and have a nice day. Enjoy your meeting. I will move on to Foreign Minister Wu. Mr. Wu, could you tell us some of the pressures that China has been putting Taiwan under in recent months? I think Europe has begun to feel these pressures over the course of the pandemic in recent months as this crisis has unfolded. Of course, Taiwan has been experiencing it for a lot longer.
Yes.
And how are China's actions in Hong Kong being viewed in Taipei?
If you look at the situation in this part of the world, Taiwan is not the only country that is suffering from the Chinese pressure. If you look at India, it has a border conflict with China right now. And if you look at East China Sea, Japan and China are escalating their dispute over the disputed territory over the East China Sea. And in Hong Kong, the Chinese government is ready to pass the national security legislation by the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. And that is putting a lot of pressure on the Hong Kong people. And of course, for Taiwan, we've been dealing with the pressure coming from China for years and years. But in the period of the pandemic, we are feeling more heat from China, from a more assertive China than ever. They have been sending military aircrafts or vessels to conduct exercises around Taiwan. And some of the exercises are more intimidating than before. And at some point, they are conducting their exercises in a reckless way. So we are feeling heat from the Chinese military pressure. And on the diplomatic side, it is the same. Whoever wants to be friends with Taiwan, they all have to face the Chinese pressure. And the Chinese ambassador, as our friend from Europe was saying, the Chinese ambassadors in Europe were coming up with a very strong, very reckless languages against the host countries. And this is something that we have been dealing with for years, and it's getting worse in the recent months. So this is kind of pressure that we are feeling. But I would like to come back to the situation that I said a little bit earlier. I think we are seeing two competing paradigms in dealing with COVID-19. On the one hand is democracy and transparency. On the other hand is the authoritarianism. And I think it's not just the competition for a model for dealing with COVID-19. It's also two philosophies, two ways of life. And I think Taiwan is very clear. We are standing on the side of democracy. And this is what we are seeing right now. And if we look at what China is trying to put the pressure on in India, in Hong Kong, in the South China Sea, in Taiwan, or in East China Sea, the closest to China, other than Hong Kong, which is already under China, is Taiwan. And Taiwan happens to be a frontline country, and we feel the heat more than any other country. And this is something that we need to put up with. But at the same time, we know our responsibilities in standing firm against China so that China does not take Taiwan over, so that China does not destroy Taiwan's democracy. And if we stand strong, I'm sure all other democracies will feel that they have a hope in dealing with China as well.
Thank you. I wanted to turn to Senator Coons again. As I mentioned, we've seen a real escalation in the rhetoric between Beijing and Washington since the COVID-19 outbreak. It has become very raw. We're heading into a US election campaign. Do you think it's possible to return to a more measured approach in Washington towards China? Oh, you've got your, yeah, there you go.
I certainly hope that a more measured approach, a more thoughtful, a more bipartisan approach is possible. I think in the context of this campaign, you will see a steadily escalating language on both sides from both American political parties. But what I think this moment calls for is for us to build a broad bipartisan and sustainable basis of US-China relations. Let me speak for a moment, if I could, to Foreign Minister Wu's comments. I was honored to have the chance to visit Taiwan in April of 2019 and to meet with Foreign Minister Wu and President Tsai. And I think it's important for all of us to recognize, as he just said, that we are in a global competition of two different ways of organizing societies. One that respects individual liberties and rights, that promotes democracy and human rights and a free press, and another that has a centralized society and economy, and one that is in competition with us for the ideas and for the allegiance and partnership of dozens and dozens of countries around the world. I think that Taiwan is a success story that deserves to be celebrated. But I also think it's important that Taiwan's fellow open societies around the world recognize that sovereignty between Taiwan and China, consistent with the One China policy, should be decided peacefully, consistent with the will of the people of Taiwan. Taiwan has become remarkable in its productivity and its resilience. I had a chance to meet with leaders from its semiconductor industry, which is the world's leading industry in something that is absolutely critical, not just to our current stage of development and technology globally, but to emerging technologies and industries of the future. Taiwan's people have earned the right to shape their own future free from influence from larger neighbors. And I think it's going to be a real test of our resiliency and of our commitment as a global community of allies. I do think it is ironic that the German Marshall Fund is the convener of this conversation today, and that the day before the anniversary of D-Day, the 6th of June, which was a moment when the free nations of the world gathered together to try and liberate Europe and then ultimately succeed in liberating Europe in 1944 at great human cost, that the Trump administration announced an intention to withdraw a third of our forces from Germany. I frankly think that the United States should be shoring up efforts by our critical and valued partners. We should be joining with President Macron's Act A initiative to combat COVID-19. We should be finding ways to engage in a positive and purposeful way. If we have concerns about the WHO, about transparency and about their initial response, of course, we should address them, but not by severing our ties. The United States has the leadership of the G7 this year. And rather than trying to expand it to somehow include Putin and Putin's Russia, the United States should be demonstrating a leadership that shows confidence in our own model, an openness to continuing an embrace of our long-standing allies, and the ability to help together with our trusted allies lead innovative solutions, not just to this current crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic, but to the challenges of this year, this decade, and this century. And I think embracing our closest partners that are rooted in shared values is the best way forward for the United States in this moment.
Senator Coons, I wanted to come back to you with another question. We do have an election coming up in November. Everyone talks about how China is the one issue where there is a bipartisan consensus in Washington. But I imagine that if we did see a change in the White House next year, that it would lead to some changes, at least on the margins in US-China policy. What would these changes look like, do you think?
Well, look, what I am concerned that there is an emerging consensus around is that each party is trying to outcompete the other in sounding tougher on China. But we have to, at some point here, get back to governing and to leading. And to me, reckless calls for a complete decoupling of the United States and China just miss the current economic and technological realities of our supply chains, of our integration, of our academic connections, and over-demonizing China to overcompensate for our own internal challenges, I think is a mistake. I do think that there are critical ways in which we must and we need to decouple around some critical technologies and some critical supply chain vulnerabilities that the United States faces. But you know, a metaphor that's been widely discussed is that we should have a high fence around a small yard rather than trying to build a very wide division, a near complete decoupling between the United States and China. I think if there is a Biden administration next year, you will see a more balanced and thoughtful, a less jingoistic approach to the US-China relationship, one that stands firm in defending American principle and interests, but that sees that the best way to do that is by sustaining our decades-long close partnerships with other free societies around the world that are rooted in shared values. We have to put values first. And when we put American interests first and pick, frankly, divisive and needless fights with tariffs or with unilateral demands, we weaken our global network of critical allies. And so speaking for myself, those are the things that I would be advocating for, that I advocate now, and that I would advocate for if there happened to be a change in administration. We only have one American administration at a time. I've done my best to work with the Trump administration and to recognize the positive steps they've taken when that's happened. One of the things I complimented President Trump on was signing into law the Taipei Act that I co-sponsored with Senator Gardner of Colorado. It speaks to some of the issues Foreign Minister Wu was just raising. But I think President Trump has taken some steps and some measures that have created critical distance between the United States and our long trusted allies that weakens us in our ongoing challenges in regards to China. And I think the way in which we have approached our most trusted allies around the world, whether it's on Huawei and 5G, it's on trade issues, it's on contributions to NATO, have created a distance that is not helpful in this absolutely pivotal moment in global history, as people are looking to which model will best advance human liberty, prosperity, and justice. The United States needs to lead by example. Thank you.
Reinhard Bütikofer, do you believe there is any appetite in Europe at the top levels of government for a more structured transatlantic coalition against China? The New York Times reported that one of the reasons that Angela Merkel declined Donald Trump's invitation to the G7 summit this month was that she didn't want to be part of an anti-China club.
Well, just look at what the European Union does and what member states do. So the German government, for instance, last year co-organized in Washington, D.C., a seminar together with CSIS and high officials from the Trump administration on China, including European, in particular, German think tank people, politicians, and American counterparts. You look at what the HRVP says, Mr. Borrell, about working together with partners. And I think it's almost impossible to find anybody, whether in Brussels or in the national capitals, that would not be more than happy if the next US administration would, whoever that would be, follow the advice that Senator Coons just gave. He emphasized the most salient point. are we in for alliance, or even, which is more prestigious, partnership, or are we just considered allies, followers that are to be told what to do today, and maybe tomorrow the marching orders will be different? I mean, Europe has to protect its own values, which we share with the United States, but also its own interests. And in that regard, there must be an effort from either side of the Atlantic to come together. I would say that when you look at the level of efforts within groups of parliamentarians, both from the US Congress and from the European Parliament and from national parliaments, to work together, that demonstrates the existence of a strong will to make that partnership functional again. And the fact that the Chancellor didn't travel to Washington, I have been told that this is not really an exceptional step. As far as historians tell us, no single German chancellor has ever traveled to the United States in an election year later than April. And I think it's wise not to be to become part of an electoral campaign this way or that way.
I want to go back to Foreign Minister Wu before we go to Q&A, but first, Mr. Bütikofer, can you tell us very quickly about this interparliamentary alliance on China that was announced last week? It groups lawmakers from, I think, eight or nine parliaments around the globe. And I think the aim is to push governments to adopt a tougher stance on China.
Well, it's a wide-ranging alliance. For instance, the United States Congress is represented by Senators Rubio and Menendez. In the European Parliament, there are people from different political groups joining. And so far, I think parliamentarians from more than 10 countries have joined. And the dynamic is still there. This is trying to assemble people on the basis of our agreement on some basic values, in particular, defense of human rights, defense of the rights of ethnic minorities, for instance, against forced labor and exploitation, and a defense against foreign interference in our democratic processes, and also, of course, defense of a rules-based international order, the international rule of law and multilateralism. And if you have on one side Ian Duncan Smith, the arch Brexiteer, and on the other side a Labour person, if you have people from different sides of the political spectrum, I think that's an interesting initiative to show what we all share.
Well, I see we have a few questions coming in, but I wanted to come back to you, Foreign Minister Wu, with one final question related to decoupling. Senator Coons mentioned reckless calls for complete decoupling. Taiwan's closest political ally is the United States, but Taiwan also has very close economic ties to China. This makes the U.S. push for decoupling quite challenging, I imagine. Can you tell us a little bit about how Taiwan is navigating these competing pressures to maintain close economic ties to China and satisfy U.S. demands that this relationship be pared back?
Indeed, that is a very tough situation for us to face. If you look around the world, I guess there's no other country or no other democracy that is having such a close economic ties with China, and at the same time facing such a strong military threat from China at the same time. So the situation in between Taiwan and China is already very challenging to us. But now we are seeing that there's a restructuring of supply chain issue that is being discussed. We think that that might be sensible if we think along the line that the critical supplies of or the supply of critical materials that are in the hands of friends or allies. And of course, if you look at the supplies of Taiwan's critical materials, seem to be helping the international community in recent period of time. So if the restructuring of the supply chain of the critical materials, and Taiwan can play a significant part in it, I think that will be a very good role for Taiwan to play. And I think they are already very good friends, either from the United States or from Europe already saying that they are looking at Taiwan as a natural partner in this type of restructuring of the supply chain of critical materials. And we'll be very happy to participate in this regard. But if there's going to be a forceful decoupling, and I think Taiwan is going to face a very tough issue. Taiwan businessmen not only does business in the United States, but they also do business in China. And therefore, asking them to choose one side over another is going to be a very tough situation for them to face. But for the Taiwanese government, I think the supply chain issue is very important, as long as Taiwan is seen as a reliable partner in this supply chain. And I think we will work together with the United States as much as possible.
Thank you very much. I want to take, we have about 10 minutes left. I want to take some questions from the audience. I will throw them out there, and then maybe we can go through them. Each panelist can offer some responses, some final comments to these questions. The first question: how will Russia react to the current tensions between the U.S. and China? Will it put all its chips on cooperation with China, or will it try to hedge its bets and try to reduce tensions with Europe and the US? That might be a question for Mr. Bütikofer. For Senator Coons, would the election of Joe Biden, if it happens, calm down the situation and avoid a Cold War? That sort of mirrors a question we touched on earlier. And let's see. Another question: what does it take for governments to focus more on democratic values? This may be a good question for Minister Wu. The national security law in Hong Kong has led to global condemnation, but not many are taking action. Human rights come secondary to economic priorities. Do we need stronger, more binding policies? So I think it probably makes sense for Reinhard, for you to start off with the question about China and Russia. Is that a concern for you? Then we can jump to Senator Coons on prospects for a Biden presidency and what that would mean. And lastly, Minister Wu on democracy.
Well, I would argue that President Putin is indeed putting most of his pawns into the Chinese camp. Of course, he also wants to take advantage of some superficial strategic thinking that you see sometimes in Washington, D.C., but also in some European capitals, where leaders seem to believe that they can woo Russia away from China. I don't believe that. In that regard, I think Mrs. Merkel is pursuing a very clear-eyed course. And maybe when you hinted earlier, Noah, that maybe the chancellor should learn to be a bit more critical about China from others, maybe from President Macron. Vice versa, President Macron might learn from her how to not fall for the questionable charms of President Putin.
Thank you. Senator Coons, do you have anything to add to the question? What would we see if we have a change in the White House in terms of China policy in coming out of Washington?
Well, if I might, Noah, thanks for the opportunity to be on and to speak to questions and to join this panel. I want to be clear that I see, and many who I work with and support see, reasons to be gravely concerned about China and their aggressive actions in the world, the ways in which China under Xi Jinping's leadership has really changed direction and has put more and more pressure on the South China Sea, has expanded human rights violations in Xinjiang province and against the Uyghurs, among many others. Recent steps with regards to Hong Kong, which have rightly faced global condemnation, make it clear that the concerns of the Chinese Communist Party are principally about control rather than respecting treaties, relationships, and the region. And so I think where we go in terms of US-China relations will depend as much, if not more, on whether China moderates its behavior and is willing to listen to global concerns and outcry about their oppressive and aggressive actions, first. Second, I do think, to the question you asked, that in Russia, Putin is cheering or celebrating anything that divides the United States and its democratic partners and allies in Europe, and anything that increases America's internal division. It is unquestioned, or should be unquestioned, that Russia directly and intentionally interfered in the United States presidential elections in 2016 and seeks to amplify internal division in the United States through the use of its security forces and its misdeeds on social media here. We should respond to that by strengthening our own civil society, strengthening our own democracy, and healing our country in ways that I think a President Biden is uniquely qualified to do. He has just visited with the family of George Floyd in Houston, is putting out messages today and this week that fit with the arc of his service in public life, which is one that seeks to heal the divisions in the United States. And I think if we do address and heal our own injustices, that will strengthen our standing in the world to partner with China in certain areas where it is required, to challenge and compete with China on the basis of a stronger America and stronger alliances where that is more likely to be successful, but to stand firm against ways in which China's aggression in the region and globally have weakened democracies and have weakened our international systems. So I hope that is a constructive brief review of ways in which I think a values-based leadership that looks inward first at fixing things in our own country, that looks outward to embrace our allies in this moment, and then sees China in a complex way as a country with which we can and should partner, compete, and on occasion when called for, confront. I do think that's where we would be headed if there were a change in the White House and in the Senate in this upcoming American elections.
Thank you, Senator Coons. A final question to you, Minister Wu, about, I think the questioner was talking about mentioning a lack of concrete actions. We've had some, in support of Hong Kong, we've had some rhetorical support. Britain is now taking action, offering asylum for Hong Kong citizens. What can you say about that? Is Taiwan getting enough support? Is there enough support out there for democratic societies on the front lines of this U.S.-China competition?
We are not only getting a lot of support from the like-minded countries, the federal democracies. We are also trying to offer support to Hong Kong. And personally, I was very happy to see the foreign ministers of the United States, UK, Australia, and Germany, and also France, coming up to say that they are willing to accept the Hong Kong people who are going to flee the place for fear of political persecution. And I think we are also doing the same. Our government is about to make an announcement of our plan to offer help to the Hong Kong people who want to seek refuge in Taiwan. We do it in a rather low-key way, but I think that is probably the most effective way in helping the Hong Kong people. And for Taiwan's own perspective, of course, we don't want to fight against the authoritarianism alone. And therefore, we try to make concrete contributions to international issues that our like-minded partners care about. For example, on the issue of North Korea, on the issue of terrorism, or on other major international issues that we care about, Taiwan stands ready to work together with other countries. We understand that is the best way for the international community to understand the value of Taiwan. And the time when Taiwan needs support, those partners will come and support Taiwan. And I would like to join Senator Coons to thank the German Marshall Fund for inviting me so that the voice from Taiwan can be heard. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Wu. Unfortunately, our time is up. I think we could go on talking about these issues for another few hours. I'd like to thank Taiwanese Foreign Minister Wu, Senator Chris Coons, and Reinhard Bütikofer of the European Parliament, as well as Marsha Blackburn, Senator from Tennessee, who had to drop off a bit early. Thanks to all of you who are out there listening, took time out of your days to listen to this fascinating discussion. I just want to, before we leave, point out that in half an hour, Brussels Forum will be streaming an interview with German Defense Minister Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer. I'm told that people should refresh their browser, so you have time to go get a coffee, look at your emails, and then come back. That should be a fascinating interview. Thanks again to everyone, all the panelists, and everyone in the audience out there. Stay healthy and have a nice day.
And you. Thank you, Noah.
关掉。